was once idolized by the Italian people. He was their leader, their pupil. He led his countrymen along the road to glory, but he lost his way and took them down the turning to catastrophe. How did Benito Mussolini win and lose the love of Italy? It was in May 1915 that Italy entered the Great War on the side of Britain and France. She was to fight along 350 miles of the most difficult terrain, high in the Alps dividing Italy and Austria. By the time the Italians arrived to take up their positions, the well-armed enemy already held the heights. As the men deployed, patriotic feeling in the ranks was high. But many criticized the government who'd sent them to fight in thin green uniforms that would make them easy targets in the snow. Food and ammunition were in short supply, and their guns and equipment were mostly obsolete. Even their barbed wire cutters wouldn't work. 32-year-old journalist Benito Mussolini, a private in the Bersaglieri Reserves, was called up on the 31st of August. Within 2 days, he was at the front, eager to fight the hated Austrians sniping from the safety of the peaks above. Mussolini was a good soldier and popular with his comrades. Soon he was made a corporal for always being first in operations of audacity and courage. He endured without complaint the hardships of the static mountain war, sending back to his newspaper in Milan exaggerated accounts of his exploits. On February the 23rd, 1917, he was senior corporal in charge of grenade mortars on Hill 144. At 2 in the afternoon, he was demonstrating a mortar to new recruits when it exploded. Almost dead, he went to hospital with 40 pieces of shrapnel in his body. After 27 operations performed without proper anesthetic and many months in hospital, Mussolini applied for and received a medical discharge. Soon after he returned to Milan, the Italians suffered a humiliating defeat at Caporetto. The reasons were military and complex. But Mussolini's newspaper articles blamed defeatism, instilled into the hearts of the Italian troops by socialist and Bolshevik pacifists at home. Then, in October 1918, the Italian army made a determined counterattack. This time it was the enemy who ran. When the armistice was signed on November the 4th, 1918, Mussolini wrote the headline, "Peace has broken out." He foresaw the troubles ahead. 600,000 Italians had paid for peace with their lives. 1.5 million were wounded or mutilated. Italy's economy lay in ruins, and the 2.5 million men who were coming home to savor the fruits of victory would find only hunger and unemployment. The final blow was to be the news that Italy would not receive the lands and islands that Britain and France had promised her in the 1915 Treaty of London. The Italians criticized their government and king for allowing them to be cheated of the spoils of war. Mussolini shared the general mood of anger and disillusionment, only more so, for in 1914, he had been foremost in calling his countrymen to fight. Throughout 1919, socialist and Bolshevik-inspired strikes and demonstrations prevented economic recovery. Italy was on the verge of revolution. Mussolini saw that revolution might provide a way to power. So he formed an action squad of unemployed ex-soldiers and malcontents and ordered them to stir up trouble. The fascist movement had begun. By 1920, continued demonstrations and strikes had reduced Italy to chaos. Mussolini called for revolution, and so competed with the socialists and Bolsheviks for the title Champion of the Workers. He sent his squads to support the picket lines. He became known as the Lenin of Italy. The government received a report from Milan's security police that Mussolini's politics were inconsistent and difficult to understand. The man is an opportunist, the report said, anti-communist and anti-king, interested not in money, only in power. Rich Italians in industry and government were afraid of a Russian-style revolution, so they offered to finance Mussolini if he would use his fascist movement to subdue the threatening forces of the left. Such backing would bring the power he wanted. So Mussolini took the money and unashamedly became the bodyguard of capitalism. Soon his squads were sent to attack the striking workers they'd previously helped, and to burn left-wing newspapers and political headquarters. By 1921, Mussolini's black shirts numbered thousands, and with the unofficial blessing of the government, they were on the rampage across the nation. As they marched, they sang about their leader. He is an electric current. His voltage runs up high. Lay hands on Mussolini, and probably you'll die. In 2 years, these squads battered to death over 3,000 socialists and communists. Many more were crippled or made to swallow pints of castor oil to purge their politics. Italy's upper classes were happy that the disorganized left-wing attempt at revolution had faded, but they were worried by the growth of the fascist movement. It was developing into a monster that not even Mussolini could control. In April 1921, Parliament was dissolved. In the hope that fascism would help fight the reformists of the Catholic and Socialist parties, the Prime Minister offered Mussolini a place in the Liberal Democratic bloc. In the elections, 35 fascists, led by Mussolini, gained seats. The re-elected Prime Minister was delighted, until Mussolini called a truce with the socialists. The squads were angry too. They refused to acknowledge the truce. Benito resigned his leadership, but regretting the loss of power, came back, disowned the treaty, and ordered even more violence against the socialists. Gangs of fascists were happy to oblige, and the police were content to stand and watch. In November 1921, Mussolini transformed his movement into the National Fascist Party. He believed that as its leader, he would gain respectability and eventually a chance of real power in Parliament. A year later, his party held a rally in Naples. Here, impatient factions demanded that Mussolini issue an ultimatum to the king and government that if the fascists were not given power, they would march on Rome and take it by force. Mussolini felt that it was premature, but fearful of being ousted, he did as he was asked. Having flung down the gauntlet, he returned to Milan to await the storm. The government called in troops for the defense of Rome. Outside Mussolini's newspaper office, faithful black shirts stood guard. Inside, he sipped milk to soothe his nagging nervous ulcer, wrote headlines threatening the government, and planned an escape route to Switzerland in case the revolution failed. By November the 28th, 1922, the fascists had mustered a force of approximately 40,000 men. The government had rejected their ultimatum. So, from the safety of his desk, Mussolini ordered the march on Rome. In the capital, the army awaited the confrontation with mixed feelings. Though loyal to their monarch, many soldiers wore the black shirt beneath their uniforms and were loath to fire on fellow fascists. King Victor Emmanuel returned to Rome uncertain of his future. If he fought the fascists and lost, they would certainly depose him. But if he gave them power, could they be relied upon to let him keep his throne? His hesitancy solved his problem. The government resigned, and news came that Mussolini had announced that he was no longer anti-monarchist. The king cabled the fascist leader to come to Rome and form a government. Mussolini accepted, and to stop the socialist newspaper Avanti calling for a general strike in protest, he destroyed it. At 8:30 a.m. on October the 30th, 1922, 39 years old Benito Mussolini, dressed in a borrowed morning suit, left Milan to become Premier of Italy. In the capital next day, he went to pay homage to the king and present his list of ministers. The king was relieved to see that Mussolini had included only 4 fascists in a coalition cabinet. Mussolini promised to serve the Constitution. Then this atheist, who'd often challenged God, if he existed, to strike him dead, called upon the Lord to give him guidance. The ministers were stunned. Was this really Mussolini? Relieved that he had saved his land from civil war and kept his crown, the king took the salute at a fascist march past. There was a general feeling of relief at the outcome, but many realized that they knew very little about fascism or what it stood for. Mussolini had said that it stood for action, and still more action, but he had never put forward any consistent policy for the future. So the Italians could only hope that fascism would bring back prosperity and order, and if to achieve it there had to be a few blows from clubs or a dose or two of castor oil, well, anything was better than the chaos of the past few years. Around midday, the fascists, celebrating in the streets of Rome, began to wonder where their leader was. Mussolini, ever the opportunist, was busy with a willing secretary on the Persian carpet of his new office in the presidential palace. Eventually, he came to let them do him homage. He was Italy's 39th premier in 60 years, and the youngest. In this, the first of his speeches from a balcony in Rome, he promised that if they would believe, obey, and if necessary, fight, he would make Italy the greatest country in Europe, if not the world. He claimed that he alone had the power, the courage, and the ability to do so. The crowd below tried hard to believe, for here at last, they had a leader, a duce, who was one of them, a man of the people. Mussolini's parents came from Romagna, a province of northeast Italy. They were poor, but not peasants. His mother, Rosa, was a school teacher, kind and patient with her pupils, and very religious, which was why villagers of Dovia were shocked to hear that she was marrying blacksmith Alessandro Mussolini, the atheist, a womanizing revolutionary who was often fighting drunk. The unlikely couple went to live here, and 10 months later, on July the 29th, 1883, while Alessandro was in the local bar, Rosa had a son. His father named him after 3 famous revolutionaries, Benito, Amilcare, Andrea. He didn't speak a word until he was 3, and then he hardly stopped. At school, Benito waged perpetual war against his teachers. Jealous of the richer boys who could pay for better food, he stabbed one in the buttock with his pocket knife. That term he was expelled. More and more he felt inferior, so more and more he adopted a wild and arrogant manner. One day, Mama, he said, I will shake the world. At 18, he was a teacher, a journalist, an extreme socialist, and unemployed. So he spent his time chasing village girls, seducing them violently, quickly, when and wherever he could. That was his style of sex, and he never changed. In 1909, he made 17-year-old Rachele Guidi pregnant. Before they married, their daughter Edda would be 6. By 29, Benito was editor of Italy's biggest socialist newspaper, Avanti. When war broke out in 1914, he towed the party line, non-intervention. But fear of Germany made him change his mind. He wrote urging Italy into the war on Britain's side. The Socialist Party took away his ticket, and Avanti sacked him. So he started his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, secretly financed by an Italian industrialist and the French government. The socialists attacked him, the police arrested him, and politicians challenged him to duels. Still, Mussolini urged his country into war, and he went on doing so until they entered it in 1915. In 1922, the king exuded friendship as he greeted his new premier. But there was and always would be hostility between them. Behind his back, the king called Mussolini an uncouth ignoramus with an ulcer. Mussolini said privately that the little sardine had better behave himself or out he'd go. One thing, however, was clear to both of them. They needed each other. Having reached the top in politics, Mussolini was quite prepared to use all earthly means to stay there. But he feared the power of the supernatural. He always wore the medallion that his mother gave him as she died. He never missed the chance to pat a hunchback for luck. And if he sensed that some anti-fascist in the crowd had fixed him with the evil eye, he would ward away the influence by touching his testicles. One cold December day in his first year of office, Mussolini arrived in London. He'd come for talks on German post-war debts. King George sent his personal aide to welcome him. The Times said his eyes were hypnotic. The Mail, that his magnificent chest was as broad as Caruso's. And some British fascists admired the spats he wore to hide his scruffy shoes. But the politicians were unimpressed, and little was achieved. Leaving in a huff, the Duce declared, in future, Italy must be treated like a sister, not like the maid. Back in Rome, he found that public order had been restored. But there were problems in the north. Many squads had refused to stop fighting. He would have to discipline them. The newly formed fascist Grand Council had the answer. The squads must be recruited into a national militia, financed by the state, but under oath to Mussolini. The king complained that it was not constitutional. Then he meekly signed the decree authorizing Mussolini's private army. Now the Duce openly declared that his idols were order and discipline, not liberalism and liberty. Fascism, he said, has already passed over the decaying corpse of liberty once. If necessary, it will repeat the maneuver. In May 1923, Britain's king and queen went to Rome. The fascist band and the king's army band couldn't agree whose anthem should come first. So the Royal March competed with the fascist hymn, Giovinezza. On the balcony, Italy's Queen Mother told George V that Mussolini represented the preservation of all that she held dear. His Majesty sent roses to Signora Mussolini and gave her husband an honorary Order of the Bath. Benito's family pulled his leg about it, and even he could see the joke. The Duce very seldom bathed. That summer, Mussolini ordered the occupation of the Greek island Corfu. This was a reprisal for the murder of 5 Italian officers visiting the disputed borders of Albania and Greece. In fact, the killers were Albanian, but the Duce said they were Greek and that he would occupy Corfu until his conditions were met in full. Under pressure from other European powers, the Greeks were forced to pay a fine of 50 million lira. The Duce chafed that many of his other demands of the Greeks had not been met, but he hid his feelings and proclaimed it a total victory. It was, he said, proof that as long as he was in power, Italian honor would never again be defiled by a foreign government. For the Italians, this was more like it. They were delighted that although they had been cheated of some of the spoils of war, this tough prime minister was giving them back their self-respect. Capitalizing on his popularity, the Duce called for a general election. A bigger majority in Parliament would secure his position. When polling started in April 1924, the electoral law had been changed, at Mussolini's insistence, from proportional representation to one giving 66% of the seats to the party gaining the most votes. Fascism received 1.5 million more votes than all the other parties put together. The socialists said this was achieved by intimidation, violence, miscounts, and every other crooked method. Giacomo Matteotti, a leading socialist MP, openly accused Mussolini of corruption. He demanded a new election. Fascist killers silenced him. Matteotti had been adored by socialists and respected by men of every party. And this time it seemed that the fascists had gone too far. Mussolini, too, was sad, but not out of sympathy for Matteotti. He was afraid that the backlash of national disgust would bring him down. He denied involvement in the crime, but nobody believed him. Certain that their Duce was finished, his closest collaborators avoided him like the plague. He sought solace at the zoo with Italia, a cub given to him after he'd declared in a fiery speech that he'd rather live one day as a lion than 1,000 years as a lamb. Anti-fascist politicians begged the king to remove Mussolini whilst he could, but the monarch feared that if he did, the fascists would rise again and take away his crown. "I am blind and deaf," he said. Finally, the fascist party rallied round, and the Duce gained a vote of confidence in Parliament. The opposition had already walked out in protest. Taking advantage of their absence, Mussolini made any criticism of his regime an act of treason and authorized special tribunals to put the opposition in jail if they misbehaved. The days of democracy were almost over. During 1925 and 26, there were several attempts to assassinate the Duce. Miss Violet Gibson, a crazy Irish woman, shot a tiny bullet through his nose. To show the world his magnanimity, Mussolini let her go. Another time, a bullet hit the Duce in the chest, but it bounced off his armored vest, and the would-be assassin, a boy of 15, was lynched. Mussolini used such attempts on his life as excuses for further erosion of Italian freedom. By 1927, he had completely muzzled the anti-fascist press, virtually wiped out all political opposition, and imposed a mass of restrictive legislation. Parliament was now his pawn, and the king a puppet who signed decrees to order. Mussolini had reached his goal, the ultimate in power. He was now a dictator. Many democratic governments agreed that Mussolini was just what Italy needed, and visitors were full of admiration. One, Winston Churchill, said, "It is absurd to say that Mussolini is kept in office by anything but the will of the Italian people. Were I one, I would have been with him wholeheartedly in his fight against the bestial appetites of Bolshevism." In 1928, Mussolini decreed that the Pontine marshlands be drained. 146 previous attempts to master this 3 million acre malarial swamp had failed. The duchies would succeed. New jobs were created and the unemployment figures slumped. At home, the dictator's prestige rose even higher, and he made sure that his battle of the marshes was given wide and extravagant publicity abroad. As the Pontine lands were drained, Mussolini announced the Battle of the Grain, his plan to make Italy self-sufficient in flour. The Duchy built roads on a scale unseen in Italy since Roman times. Soon new railways linked the major towns and cities, and Mussolini saw to it that trains ran on time. Such was Mussolini's fame and reputation now that thousands of letters from all over the world arrived daily at his vast office in Rome. One from an unknown Austrian called Adolf Hitler begged for a signed photo of his idol. Mussolini refused. In February 1929, the Italians were overcome with joy. Their genius of a duce had excelled himself by finally solving an age-old Italian problem. For 14 centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, Italy was oppressed and divided by foreign powers, princes, and popes. But gradually the peninsula was unified, and finally the last of the papal states was seized. Rome was made a national capital once again. Since that time in 1870, successive popes had refused to negotiate with the state, a state whose existence they didn't recognize, and ordered devout Catholics not to take part in its affairs. It took the charm of a dedicated atheist to settle the affair. The Duce agreed to recognize the Pope's authority in moral matters, to ban divorce, to make Catholicism the official religion of the state, and to pay compensation for confiscated papal property. The price was high, but the Pope held sway over the Italian soul, and Mussolini needed his cooperation if fascism was to last forever. The Pontiff generously called Benito the man who had given Italy back to God. Mussolini boasted that he had locked up the Pope in the fascist state. The unholy marriage of convenience between the Duce and the Pope would never be a happy one, and it was over the education of the children that they would bicker most. Ex-schoolteacher Mussolini altered the curriculum so that all learning was related to the glory of the Roman Empire, to fascism, and to him. Pupils were reminded daily that their Duce was always right, that his eyes were always upon them, that they must obey him without question, be ready to die for him, and regard him as their God. The Pope condemned Mussolini's self-elevation into deity. He was also jealous of the rise in popularity of the fascist youth movement, the Balilla, and the forced decline of the Catholic equivalent. Mussolini made the book and the rifle the symbols of his Balilla, and ordered them to swear an oath that the Pope called blasphemous. I believe in the genius of the Duce, in the Holy Father, fascism, in the communion of its martyrs, and in the coming of a great Italian empire. Knowing that an empire wouldn't come without a fight, Mussolini saw that his mini-fascists were taught the ways of modern warfare. A top reward for diligence was a visit to the Duce's office, or the even greater honor of standing guard outside. 1930, Mussolini's master plan to toughen up the Italian race was well established. All citizens were encouraged to join in the sporting antics of the National Institute for After-Work Activities. Public spectacles were regularly performed in an Olympic-style arena near Rome. The head referee of fascist football blew a solid gold whistle. On the rare occasions when he had time to relax at home, Papa Duce enjoyed a game of football with his children. But unlike Italy, on the rare occasions when he had time to relax at home, Papa Duce enjoyed a game of football with his children. But unlike Italy, the ball often failed to travel in the direction in which it was kicked. When he broke a window, he was made to pay a fine of 30 lire by his wife. Rachele was quite unimpressed by her husband's rise to power. If he interfered at home, she shut him up. She was the Duce in their rented Roman mansion. The magnificent Villa Torlonia had been turned into a simple peasant home by Rachele Mussolini. She planted Benito's favorite vegetables in the flower beds. Signora Mussolini complained often that her husband was the only fascist who despised money. He could have been as rich as Caesar, but seldom bothered to draw his salary. His family lived frugally on his continued work in journalism. The Mussolinis had 5 children. Anna Maria, the youngest, was crippled by polio at the age of 6. She died in 1968. Romano is today a professional jazz pianist. He took the love of music from his father, who played the violin quite well. Bruno shared his papa's enthusiasm for flying. He became a pilot and died when his plane crashed in 1941. Vittorio took the flair for journalism and now lives with his mother in Romagna. Eda too is living. She inherited her father's temperament. The Romans called her the mad filly. At 20, when she married, her parents were delighted, for the secret police reports on her previous love life had made what little hair the Duce had stand up. There had been romances with a boxer, a station master, and many others, including an Indian. So when at last she settled for the handsome Galeazzo Ciano, an ardent fascist from a good family, her father breathed a sigh of considerable relief. Once safely married, the Duce expected Eda to set a good example to those unpatriotic women who were failing to cooperate in his battle for babies. Italy's population stood at 40 million, but Mussolini wanted more to help him gain an empire. So he demoted childless army officers, taxed bachelors, and gave the money to fruitful mothers like these. Yet still the birth rate fell. By mid-1930, Mussolini's grossly inflated ego had earned him the nickname Il Provolone, the Big Cheese. Its originator was sent to jail. Earlier, someone had said, he is a rabbit, a magnificent rabbit. He roars, so that the crowd mistake him for a lion. Sadly, it was true. Mussolini personified strength and determination, but behind the facade, he retained childhood feelings of insecurity, inferiority, and indecision. Of course, his public never knew, and didn't want to know as long as he told them what they wanted to hear, and impersonated the tough character they wanted him to be. The Italians enjoyed his show tremendously. The expressive face and bulging eyes, the jutting chin, the punctuating movements of his arms and hands as he delivered a patriotic phrase that stirred their blood. The Duce knew that if he continually thrilled and entertained his audiences like this, they would overlook the imperfections of the regime and continue their support. And that was how it was for almost 20 years. The Italian people fell in love with him, but he never loved them in return. The race is far too soft, fat, and lazy, he said. They must be beaten. And so he beat them, and they loved him even more. In 1935, 1931, the Duce proudly drew attention to his new air force. It was an amazing array, and even the king was impressed. But corrupt officials were deceiving Mussolini, for many of these planes lacked engines. The Duce had been trying to develop military muscle for years, but now, whilst rattling his saber with one hand, he waved an olive branch with the other.
I will speak to you in a few clear words of the chief problem which interests the whole of mankind, namely, peace or war. As the Prime Minister of the Italian government and head of the fascist movement, which has been ruling Italy these 9 years, and as a man, I wish to reject and repudiate all the futile chatter and information of those people who pretend to know that Italy was to prepare for war. I repeat what I said in my speech of October 27 last. Italy will never take the initiative in promoting war.
Harvest time in 1931 brought uplifting news to a people whose economy was badly affected by the Great American Depression. Italy was at last growing all the wheat she needed. But this so-called victory in the battle for grain was really a failure. Home-produced flour would now cost more than imported. In addition, the effort that had been put into wheat had led to shortages of other crops and livestock. In the future, the Duce's many attempts to bring the benefits of self-sufficiency to Italy would fail. His people would suffer, and so would his country's economy. That winter, the Duce's brother died of a heart attack. As editor of the family newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, Arnaldo had printed many lies to help create a Superman image for the dictator. But privately, he had always told Mussolini the truth. Now there would be only the sycophantic utterings of flatterers. No one would have the courage to face the Duce with the truth if it was unpalatable. And eventually he would become dangerously detached from reality. The Duce continued with his passion for building. New towns with the most modern amenities appeared on the drained lands of Pontinia. It meant more jobs, but the workers were unhappy, for now they were just tiny cogs in a corporate state. All trades and professions were run by committees of employers, employees, and representatives of the state. Mussolini claimed that his corporate state was the answer to the class struggle, but instead it developed into a corrupt bureaucracy in which the employers grew richer and the workers were worse off. Trades unions and strikes were made illegal. The 8-hour day abolished, income tax increased. Wages were cut by 40% to keep up profits. Workers who complained were sent to prison. So no one had the courage to remind the Duce that in 1921 it was he who had said, "Down with the state that does everything and brings everything to ruin." In 1932, the ministers of the corporate state smiled smugly at one another. Their unemployment figures, they claimed, were under a third of Britain's, where government and industry secretly envied fascism's power to control labor. Increasingly, Italy was being treated with respect and admiration by foreign powers, and the Duce's ministers were convinced that soon all Europe would want fascism. The Nazis, with Mussolini's help, had already copied many of the trappings of his regime. But the Duce disliked the German adaptation, and he was repelled by reports on its leader, Adolf Hitler. March 1933 brought Ramsay MacDonald to Rome for talks about the Germans. They were secretly rearming, and the British were impotent and worried. Mussolini promised to control Hitler if Britain could persuade him to sign a four-power pact which included France. MacDonald was enthusiastic. France was not, and the pact was never signed. Fascism had made a cult of youth, and Mussolini hated the advance of years. So he held his 50th birthday party well away from Rome and told the press to ignore it and not to mention such occasions in the future. Dutifully, they added this order to the list, which also forbade any mention of his gastric ulcer, bad eyesight, weight problem, baldness, and ingrowing toenail. Editors were encouraged, however, to print that before work each morning, the Duce rode Frou-Frou, his favorite mare, that he fenced bravely, swam strongly, skied brilliantly, and was the first head of state to pilot an aeroplane. That claim, at least, was true. In 1933, this propaganda film showed an Italy that was booming. In fact, the nation was almost bankrupt. Mussolini's handling of the economy had proved disastrous. He contacted the bankers of America, showed them these films and a set of well-cooked books indicating that his national budget balanced, and borrowed millions of dollars. Soon, the loans ran into billions. Repayments stretched forward into 1987. But it wasn't money that would one day help to bring the Duce's downfall. It was an aeroplane from Germany carrying Adolf Hitler. When the dictators met for the first time in 1934, Hitler, in his ill-fitting suit and raincoat, was angry with embarrassment as he walked beside the smart Italian. Mussolini told an aide that Adolf reminded him of a plumber holding a chamber pot, and that he was quite mad. Hitler had come to ask for leave to interfere in the politics of Austria, an Italian sphere of influence. Having declined an interpreter, Mussolini, in faulty German, unwittingly gave the impression that Hitler had a free hand. The Nazi leader was delighted, until the Duce complained about his brutal treatment of the Jews. This small parade in Venice was as much as Mussolini could be bothered to put on for the benefit of his shabby German pupil. But Hitler was impressed by Mussolini and the apparent efficiency of his fascist state. Next day, bored with listening to quotations from Mein Kampf, the Duce was glad to see the Nazi go. But he sensed that Hitler spelled trouble. A month later, in Vienna, Nazis, on Hitler's orders, agitated for the government to be replaced by one sympathetic to his plan to unify Austria with Germany. The Austrian Chancellor, Dollfuss, heard that the Nazis intended to murder him, and he told Mussolini. The Duce said that Hitler would never dare to harm a man who was his friend. 10 days later, Dollfuss was dead, murdered by SS. Angrily, Mussolini dispatched 2 military units to the Brenner Pass to stand by for his order to enter Austria. The plan was applauded by the French and British governments, but to the Duce's disgust, they did nothing positive to help him preserve Austrian independence. The Duce had often said that he would not allow the integration of Austria and Germany, and now that he'd seen Hitler in his true colors, he was absolutely convinced that it would be a huge mistake for Italy ever to share a common border with the Nazis. The day that Austria is swallowed up by that horrible sexual degenerate Hitler, he said, all Europe will descend into chaos. Hitler too was fuming. His coup had been brought to a halt by the Austrians themselves, and Mussolini's unexpected reaction was the final straw. He decided to annex Austria later when he was stronger. By the end of 1934, Hitler was flagrantly disregarding the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles on German rearmament. Anxiously, Britain and France offered him a deal that excluded Italy. Hitler rejected it. But when the worried powers turned to Mussolini with a pact designed to stop Hitler, he signed. Now that he had allies to help keep Germany at bay, the Duce decided that the time had come to gain an empire. For a decade, his men had been preparing to fight for a place in the African sun. In 1935, the only place in Africa left to colonize was Abyssinia. Mussolini was confident that Britain and France, both great colonial powers, would look the other way. But as soon as he began to mobilize, the British led a protest at the League of Nations, and diplomatic pressure was applied to stop him. Winston Churchill wrote, warning him of the dangers of fighting a war 2,000 miles from home, in a disease-ridden land, against a savage people, unsubdued for over 4,000 years. Churchill also pointed out that Italy did not control the Mediterranean, and the Royal Navy made menacing maneuvers in what the Duce called our sea. But Mussolini's spies had told him that the British fleet was short of ammunition, so he brazenly condemned the race upon whose empire the sun never set, for trying to keep Italy forever in the shade. Our land cannot nourish its people, he raged. We must expand or explode. When the invasion of Abyssinia began on October the 3rd, 1935, the Duce's brainwashed troops were enthusiastic, but not their loved ones at home. In spite of Mussolini's efforts to take his people down the road to glory, they retained a civilized distaste for avoidable war. He had to find a way to stimulate their enthusiasm. Unwittingly, the League of Nations helped him out. It imposed sanctions, the first ever on a member nation. Feelings of injustice from 1918 returned, and the Italians united behind Mussolini. The British, whose idea it had been to apply sanctions against Italy, were now afraid of weakening their main bulwark against Hitler. So, whilst maintaining an effective embargo on arms to Abyssinia, they and others in the League of Nations continued to sell Mussolini the coal and oil so vital to his war. America and Russia were not in the League, and Germany had recently walked out, so they too maintained supplies. The Duce told his people the lie that they stood alone against the world. Their response was overwhelming. Here, in one of his new towns, he personally accepted gold for the war effort. Lockets, jewelry, wedding rings. At last, the Italians saw Mussolini's campaign in Abyssinia as something for which it was worth making personal sacrifice. Across the nation, similar ceremonies were taking place. In Rome, 250,000 emotional men and women went to make their contribution, receiving in return wedding rings of steel. Mussolini had collected 16 million pounds worth of gold. Fascist officials stole part of it, but when the Duce was informed, all he said was, "Who can stop rats in a granary?" Within weeks, the Italians in Abyssinia were winning, but it hadn't been an easy war, and there had been atrocities on both sides. Hitler, who wanted to weaken Italy, had secretly supplied the Abyssinians with rifles. The German rifles were no answer to the tanks, bombs, and machine guns sent in by Mussolini. On May the 9th, 1936, the Duce proclaimed that Abyssinia was Italian. The title Emperor, he said, would thereafter be borne by the King of Italy. Deliriously, the Italians hailed the conquering hero as their predecessors had in Roman times. Drugged with euphoria of victory, they excused him everything. If he had suppressed their freedom, then it must have been necessary. If his regime was corrupt, then he was unaware of it. If he had failed to solve the problems of hunger and poverty in the South, then give him time. The restoration of their honor and the empire was all that mattered now. Their cries of adulation inflated Mussolini's already magnificent ego to bursting point. He felt infallible, greater than Alexander, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon put together. This was the moment of his greatest glory. It was also the beginning of his downfall. This man was once idolized by the Italian people. He was their leader, their teacher. He led his countrymen along the road to glory, but he lost his way and took them down the turning to catastrophe. How did Benito Mussolini win and lose the love of Italy? In 1937, Benito Mussolini, now 53, went to Libya to receive the sword of Islam. The extravagant honor of being hailed by the Arabs as protector of the Islamic faith appealed to the Duce's already grossly inflated ego. He had already dictated his epitaph. Here lies one of the most intelligent animals ever to walk on earth. Unfortunately for Mussolini, this moment of supreme satisfaction was ruined by news that his army in Spain had been beaten at Guadalajara by a smaller force of Republicans. The Duce had answered General Franco's plea for military aid in 1936. Within a year, thousands of Italian black shirts were fighting in Spain. The Duce's motivation for this flagrant intervention was his desire to see fascism spread to the shores of the southern Mediterranean. But it isolated Italy still further from Britain and France, and edged Mussolini closer to Hitler, who was also helping Franco. Confidently expected a rapid victory, but the war dragged on, costing much more than the sick Italian economy could afford. Knowing that Mussolini wanted to ignore the truth, his ministers and generals minimized losses, and newspapers reported defeats in Spain as victories. Sealed up in this world of self-deception, the Duce behaved as if everything was going well, and indulged himself in a secret love affair with Clara Petacci. 27 years his junior, she was passionate, buxom, and of good Roman stock. Benito would visit her between audiences he bestowed upon the world's most important people. The special bedroom by his office was guarded by a deaf attendant. There he took her quickly, violently, with curses and shouts. Afterwards he would play with equal passion upon his violin. Though he boasted to her of sexual encounters with other women, Clara's devotion never faltered. In September 1937, when he paid his first official visit to Germany, Mussolini, the great seducer, was himself seduced by Nazi efficiency and cunning. Having shown him their vast munition factories, the Nazis staged field maneuvers, and to impress the Duce, they used live ammunition. To flatter the Italian, Hitler had ordered his generals to listen to him as if in awe of his military genius. And so they did. On the social side, Hermann Goering, whom he already knew, invited Mussolini to his home at Carden Hall. That night he was to be guest of honor at a thrilling spectacle in the Maifeld. Hitler told a gathering of almost 1 million Nazis that Mussolini was one of those rare geniuses who made history and was not simply a part of it. This was followed by glowing praise of Italian fascism and all that the Duce was said to have accomplished. In reply, Mussolini proclaimed Italy's friendship for Germany. It was a fascist ethic, he said, to be loyal to one's friends, and if necessary, to march with them to the end. But his reception had excited him so much that his German was almost unintelligible. It rained, the public address system became distorted, but the crowd, knowing what Hitler expected of them, cheered anyway. By the end of his visit, Mussolini was totally intoxicated by Nazism. Hitler had started by copying Mussolini. Now the Duce decided to adopt some of Hitler's ideas. Back in Italy, the Duce demonstrated the goose step, called it the Roman step, and told his men to learn it. When he heard that the king was appalled to see Italian soldiers aping Nazis, Mussolini said it was because the stupid little sardine knew if he tried the march, he'd only look ridiculous. Next, he forbade fascists to shake hands. The Roman salute, said Mussolini, was quicker and more hygienic. Then, declaring himself anti-Semitic, he dismissed his Jewish dentist. I don't believe in Hitler's stupid racist views, he said privately, but for political reasons, I have to pretend I do. The majority of Italians didn't believe in anti-Semitism either. They lived quite happily alongside Italy's 47,000 Jews, and were reluctant to support the Duce's anti-Jewish laws. Whilst Mussolini was trying to Prussianize Italy, Hitler finally succeeded in annexing Austria. The Duce sent a cable of congratulations. Then Mussolini had a problem of his own, that of explaining to his people why he had done nothing to save Austria. He tried to get out of it by saying that he had never at any time promised to preserve Austrian independence. But this was a lie too blatant for even the most gullible Italians to swallow. A chilly wave of disrespect swept over them, for this was weakness. They saw now that the two dictators had reversed positions, and their beloved Duce was no longer the one on top. Dismayed and angry, the crowd viewed Hitler's forthcoming visit with distaste. When the Führer came in May 1938, every building from the border to Rome had been painted, but only on the front. Elsewhere, though, no expense had been spared. In the capital, at a specially constructed railway station, Hitler was greeted by Mussolini and the king. Although King Victor Emmanuel III hated Germans, and Nazis in particular, he insisted on the royal prerogative and took precedence over Mussolini. Both dictators were furious. There was organized flag waving, but most Italians treated their visitors with cool contempt. The Pope locked the Vatican Museum and took a holiday. Next day, as they drove to review the fleet, Hitler was amused to see the diminutive king sat on cushions to give him height, and His Royal Highness noted with disgust that Hitler's pallid cheeks were rouged. In Naples, the crowd looked for their Duce, but he was nowhere to be seen. Too proud to tag behind, Mussolini had made a backstreet dash to receive Hitler on board his flagship in the harbor. Like children playing a deadly game, the dictators enjoyed displaying their toys, and now it was Hitler's turn to be impressed. During the display, Hitler suggested a military alliance, but the Duce avoided it, knowing that such a commitment would be unpopular in Italy. After 2 years of bitter fighting in Spain, Mussolini was forced to recognize that the war was ruining Italy. From his desk in Rome, he began to interfere in military strategy. His amateurism only made things worse. Though Franco was furious, Hitler was happy to see the war continue. A weak Italy would be unlikely to oppose his plan to enter Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, whilst the French were preparing to defend the Czechs, Neville Chamberlain appealed to Mussolini to intervene with Hitler. Fearing the effect on Italy of a war in Europe, the Duce talked to Hitler, and a four-power meeting in Munich was arranged. When the Duce arrived to take the train to Munich, he was clearly nervous. His mental condition of late had seriously declined. He was becoming psychologically unstable, moody, and unable to make rational decisions. Some said his affair with Clara Petacci was the cause. Others blamed his stomach ulcers. None knew for sure. but they were united in recognizing how dangerous it was for Italy to remain in his hands. Before the conference, Hitler confided to Mussolini the demand he would make, the return to Germany of the Sudetenland. It had been given to Czechoslovakia by the Treaty of Versailles, but now Hitler wanted it back. Mussolini smiled. He already knew Hitler's demands and conditions. In his pocket was a copy of a confidential German memorandum acquired by the Italian ambassador in Berlin. On the way to the meeting, Mussolini saw his opportunity to gain international prestige. He would put forward Hitler's demands as his own proposals for a peaceful settlement. At Munich, having dominated the proceedings, speaking in German, French, and English, Mussolini waited confidently for Britain and France to agree to the plan that he had put forward as his own. Eventually they did. Hitler was granted the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which was all he claimed to want, and the Duce took the credit for averting war. The Duce returned to Italy to be hailed by the King, the Pope, and the delirious Italian people as the Angel of Peace. Though he enjoyed this return to popularity, he was irritated by the extent of their habits. His attempts to turn them into a race of warriors had failed. They showed him now, beyond doubt, that all they wanted was peace. More determined than ever now to infuse Italy with the warlike spirit of the Germans, Mussolini increased his efforts to toughen up his countrymen. Senior ministers were instructed to go out and set a good example, but more often than not they succeeded only in causing amusement. Early in 1939, Mussolini made two uncharacteristic errors. He stayed away from the funeral of Pope Pius XI when he refused to attend the coronation of Pope Pius XII. This lack of respect was resented by the faithful, who recalled past insults, like Mussolini's flippant boast that one day he'd replace the cross on St. Peter's with the fascist symbol. Again, his popularity waned. It was during the papal celebrations that Mussolini received the first of many insults from Adolf Hitler. He had occupied not just the Sudetenland, but all of Czechoslovakia. Hitler's contempt for the Munich Agreement showed how misplaced had been the Duce's trust and how little influence the Duce had over him. But 2 weeks later, the news was good. The Spanish War was over. Triumph for fascism was particularly welcomed by Italy's tired troops, but their Duce was anxious to pull off his own Nazi-style invasion. Soon, an Italian expeditionary force was landing unopposed in Albania. By occupying this friendly little country, Italy gained a bridgehead in the Balkans. And by telling Hitler nothing until the deed was done, the Duce paid him back for Czechoslovakia. Now the score was even, Mussolini was prepared to accept Hitler's offer of a military alliance. Under what Mussolini called the Pact of Steel, Italy and Germany would be equal partners, pledged to help each other if either of them declared war or was attacked. But Mussolini warned Hitler that it would take 3 years to build up Italy's full military strength. Hitler assured him that he had no intention of attacking anyone. Yet the day after the signing, Hitler began preparations to invade Poland. It was not long before Mussolini grew suspicious of Hitler's intentions. He feared the Nazis would drag Italy into war. Desperately, he wanted to withdraw from the Pact of Steel, but was transfixed by the possibility of retaliation from Hitler. When Mussolini inspected his army in 1939, he was appalled to find it in a state far worse than his generals had led him to believe. They had told him there were 73 divisions. He found only 37, all pathetically ill-equipped. Many soldiers lacked proper uniforms and boots. Their rifles were mostly 50 years out of date, and there was enough ammunition for only 1 month of warfare. There was no modern artillery. Anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and machine guns were virtually non-existent. Transport was antiquated and in short supply. But if Mussolini had been deceived by his generals and defrauded by corrupt officials and arms manufacturers, he had himself to blame. Ignoring military priorities, his main concern had been such petty details as the height a soldier's foot should rise in the Roman march. And he had ridiculed his wife Raquel when she told him that the Air Force, which boasted 3,000 warplanes, had really only 1,000, and that the Navy was starved of fuel and ammunition. On the 25th of August, Hitler informed the Duce that he was about to enter Poland. Hoping to force the Führer into another Munich-style settlement, Mussolini insisted that Italy needed 17 million tons of war materials and equipment if she was to join Germany in a European war. Hitler delayed his advancing army, but since Mussolini's conditions were impossible to meet, he decided to go ahead without the Italians. As the Nazis decimated Poland, Mussolini was overcome by bitterness and envy. He longed to see his armies sharing the dazzling victories of the Wehrmacht, but instead of an heroic entry into the theater of war, he was forced to wait impotently in the wings, whilst his one-time pupil, Hitler, took the starring role. The Duce viewed this film of the Nazi victory parade in Warsaw, and in a fit of jealous rage wished Hitler dead. To make a people great, he mourned, you must kick them up the backside and lead them into battle, as he has. But the peaceable Italians had been led into enough unnecessary battles by their Duce. He had signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler against their wishes. Now, if he was the laughingstock of Europe, the problem they felt was his. In May 1940, Hitler invaded Western Europe. It was not until hours later that he told his Axis partner that he'd done so. victorious German armies advanced, Hitler suggested to the Duce that now, surely, the time must be right for Mussolini to honor his obligation and declare war. Mussolini agreed. The apparent invincibility of the Germans convinced him that if Italy was to secure her share of the spoils, he must delay no longer. On June the 10th, 7 days after Dunkirk, the square beneath Mussolini's balcony was packed. The people had been told to expect an historic announcement. Many times before, the Italians had stood in eager anticipation of such announcements by their Duce, but now the mood was quiet, uneasy, fearful. When Mussolini spoke, he told them it was war. Not for Germany, but alongside Germany, a parallel war against Britain and France. Mechanically, the crowd responded, but in their hearts, they knew. Their leader was about to take them down the turning to catastrophe. Four days after Mussolini's declaration of war, the Nazis entered Paris and the French sought terms for an armistice. Afraid that the war would be over before his forces could take part, the Duce ordered the immediate invasion of southern France. While the Italian soldiers moved forward in a state of almost total unreadiness, their generals tried desperately to convince Mussolini that he was courting disaster. Even if the invasion fails, he said, a few thousand dead troops will entitle me to sit with Hitler at the feast table. Then I shall put forward my claims to French territory. In a matter of days, the Italians were stopped with contemptuous ease by the French at Menton. Many Italian soldiers died, sacrificed by the Duce in vain. He was not invited by Hitler to attend the signing of the armistice. When the Battle of Britain began, Mussolini insisted on sending a squadron to help the Luftwaffe. A cartoon showing Churchill being pursued by Italian planes replaced Laurel and Hardy as his favorite entertainment. In August 1940, Mussolini's mistress, Clara, had a miscarriage and almost died. While she recuperated, the Duce decided to attack the British in Egypt. Once more, there were complaints from the army that they were unprepared. But Mussolini wanted to capture the Suez Canal, so again, he refused to listen. Outnumbering the British by 3-1, the Italians drove them back within a few days. The Duce had achieved his first and virtually his last real victory of the war. When Mussolini next entered the chamber in Rome, it was obvious that his prestige had been considerably restored. his next meeting with Hitler, Mussolini appeared his old confident self again. The Führer congratulated him and offered special mobile units trained in desert warfare. But Mussolini declined. He wanted to beat the British without Nazi aid. The Italian was in high spirits as he said goodbye, but not for long. Hitler was secretly planning to occupy Romania, a land Mussolini regarded as within the Italian sphere of influence. In November, when Mussolini heard of the Romanian occupation, he was furious. He ordered the immediate invasion of Greece. Now let Hitler find out, he said, what it's like to hear of an invasion afterwards. The Duce was sure that the Greeks would give in within 10 days, but from the start his campaign was doomed. Italian pilots were so badly briefed that their bombs mostly missed the targets or dropped into the sea. The first troops to land found that guns and vital equipment had been left behind in Italy. There had been no proper invasion plan. Officers countermanded one another's orders, and soon the Italians invading from Albania were bogged down in the mountains. Within weeks, bad weather and the tough, well-organized Greek army had taken their toll. 25,000 Italians were dead or captured. Mussolini sank into the depths of depression over the Italian failures in Greece, humiliated at having to ask Hitler for help. Then, to cap it all, came word that half his navy had been crippled by the British at Taranto. The news brought on a violent attack of stomach pains, and he collapsed in agony. But there was worse to come. Italian fortunes in North Africa reversed, and thousands of his men surrendered. The Duce cursed them for not abiding by their sacred fascist oath to die for him. But who could blame them? Ill-equipped, badly fed, short of water, and often poorly led by fascist civil servants instead of army officers, they were totally disenchanted. It was Mussolini's war, and they were glad to be out of it. Mussolini could normally revive his spirits by reading the propaganda he had written for his newspaper. But in December 1940, he could no longer fool himself. Hitler had agreed to send Rommel and his panzers to Africa, but the conditions were harsh. Italian workers must be sent to Germany, and the Nazis would reorganize the Italian war effort. Mussolini knew the Italians would be incensed, and it wasn't hard to guess what his people would say when they read of his Christmas present to the nation, a cut in food rations, so that supplies to Germany could be maintained. He sought omens indicating a change of fortune in 1941, but his luck, it seemed, had run out. In April, his army in Abyssinia surrendered. It was a surrender with honor, the Italian people were told. The fact that their beloved empire had been given up almost without a fight was rigidly suppressed. Greece also surrendered to Nazis diverted from the delayed invasion of Russia. Hitler later blamed his failures on the Eastern Front on the need to bail out Mussolini in Greece. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the Duce was woken at 4:30 in the morning to be told that Hitler had attacked the Russians. "Mama," he said to his wife, "the war is lost." But later, unable to control his desire to attack the communists, Mussolini sent to Russia 250,000 troops, badly needed in Africa. In boots with cardboard soles, they would fight bravely against appalling odds. Eventually, almost half lay dead in the Russian snow. Mussolini's thoughtful gift arrived too late. Crates of rosy apples marked sunshine from Italy. As the corn planted in the heart of Rome was being harvested in 1941, the realities of bereavement affecting so many Italian parents were brought home to the Mussolinis. Benito's favorite son, Bruno, was killed in a flying accident. On the 11th of December, Mussolini joined Hitler in declaring war on the USA. The news was the more appalling to the Italians, for it was to the United States that thousands of their countrymen had emigrated. It also meant an extension of the war. Though they applauded their leader, even the most fanatical fascists began to wish that he would go. Squabbling between the Italians and Germans undermined the efforts they could have been making to defeat the common foe. But despite clashes of temperament, sabotaged supplies from Italy, and military secrets that Italian generals were now transmitting to the Allies, Rommel was advancing towards Alexandria. Anxious to steal some of Rommel's glory, Mussolini went to North Africa. When Alexandria was taken, he intended to ride in, waving his sword of Islam. But almost as soon as he arrived, Rommel was stopped at Alamein. Disappointed, the Duce wandered around for several days, hoping that the advance would begin again. But the situation worsened. The Italian soldiers were saying that Mussolini was a jinx. Sadly, he returned to Rome. A few days later, on his 59th birthday, the Duce was so unapproachable that only Hitler dared to offer greetings. There was no shifting him from the pit of fatalism and despair. For 6 months, he was incapable of ruling Italy, and no one else had the power to do so. By May 1943, the battle for North Africa was over. Towards the end, exhausted and beaten, many Italians had tried to escape, but their lorries had been stolen by retreating Nazis. Others had thrown down their rifles and raced joyfully towards the Allied lines. Jokes about Italian cowardice spread around the world, but they were not substantiated by the British 8th Army newspaper. The black shirts and Bersaglieri, it said, were often comparable in courage and in fighting spirit to the best troops in the campaign. In Rome, the king was signing decrees authorizing imprisonment for anyone aiding anti-fascists. At the same time, he sought a legal excuse for locking up the Duce. Other conspirators, like Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano, and senior fascist Count Grandi, would soon provide the key. That there were many plots against him was well known to the Duce, but incredibly he did nothing to protect himself. He was convinced that as fascism was Mussoliniism, the conspirators knew that the party could not exist without him as its leader. In addition, he was confident of the king's support.
Pronto?
On the morning of July the 10th, 1943, the Allies went ashore in Sicily. The Italian defenders blew up their guns and surrendered. It was to take almost 40 days of bitter fighting and the help of the mafia before the invaders could subdue the Nazi troops inland. On the 19th of July, American planes set out to destroy railway junctions and military installations in Rome. The crews were briefed to take the greatest care, but many bombs missed their target and over 1,000 people died. For 7 days afterwards, a cloud of horror and disbelief hung over the Eternal City. Then, quite suddenly, sorrow turned to tears of joy. At last, Mussolini had gone. The Grand Council had dared to carry a vote of no confidence in him, and the king had been given a constitutional excuse for demanding his resignation. The Duce had accepted his fate, stepped down from his pedestal, and meekly gone into custody. To forestall any attempt to reinstate him, martial law was imposed. But although some fascists were berated by the crowd, not a single supporter came forward to champion the imprisoned Duce. The new administration assured Hitler that Italy would continue to fight on his side. But Hitler planned to occupy Italy as soon as possible. In an unreliable world, he told Goering, the one thing I can rely on is the unreliability of the Italians. 6 weeks after getting rid of Mussolini, the king and his ministers surrendered to the Allies. The Allied terms were so harsh that General Eisenhower refused to put his signature to the document. Fearing Nazi retribution, the royal household and the Italian government fled from Rome to Allied territory in the south, leaving Italy in the lurch without leadership or administration. Whilst these men paraded for their king in the safety of Brindisi, 1 million of their comrades in the north were without orders and at the mercy of a brutal Nazi army of occupation. On the 12th of September, as the Nazis forced their way into Italy, a band of paratroopers under special orders from Hitler stormed the Hotel Imperatore 9,000 feet up in the mountains near Rome. Mussolini was being held there, and the Nazis wanted him. Politely, he thanked them for releasing him and asked to be taken home to Romagna. But Hitler had other plans for the aging Duce. In Germany, 2 days later, the Führer greeted Mussolini with tears of genuine affection. But the Duce's smile was insincere. He had disliked the Führer from their first meeting in 1934. Now he hated the very sight of him. Again, Mussolini asked to be allowed to go quietly home. But Hitler needed him as the figurehead of a new regime which would keep Italy under control. While Mussolini discussed his future, the Italian Navy was surrendering at Malta. Later in the war, the fleet would regain its honor by fighting with enthusiasm and distinction against the Nazis. When Mussolini left Hitler's headquarters, he was exhausted. The Führer had harangued him on the need for revenge against the conspirators in the Grand Council. If Mussolini did not form a government, Hitler had said, he would hand over Italy as a plaything to the SS. This was too horrible to contemplate, so Mussolini agreed to do as he was told. On September the 29th, 1943, Mussolini inaugurated the new Fascist Republican Party. Nearer to his original concept of fascism, it was anti-capitalist, with overtones of socialism. But its power was so limited that it hardly mattered what it was. The Duce, who had once held court in a Roman palace, was now a puppet, dancing to Hitler's tune in a villa on Lake Garda. He took long, lonely walks by the lakeside and compared his life and his betrayal in the Eternal City to that of Jesus. Mussolini allowed his treacherous disciples to be shot. One of those executed was his son-in-law, Count Ciano. It weighed heavily on Mussolini's mind. He sought macabre details from witnesses and asked whether they thought his daughter Edda and his grandchildren would ever forgive him. By May 1944, the Germans were trying desperately, but without success, to stem the Allied march on Rome. Finally, on the 3rd of June, the Nazis scuttled from the capital, which was now an open city. They left behind a trail of cruelty that would never be forgotten. As the Americans entered Rome, Mussolini ordered 3 days of mourning in his northern republic. For the Romans, Allied soldiers waving from the Duce's balcony was proof that at last they were free. But they were to learn that liberty did not bring freedom from hunger. Quite the reverse. For months past, almost the only food available in Rome had been sold under the counter. Now the purchasing power of Americans would cause black market prices to soar beyond the reach of the civilian population. Here in the south, people were already starving. The retreating Nazis had destroyed or confiscated food, and now that the Allied army demanded supplementary rations, what remained went up in price by 700%. A man could work a 12-hour day and with his wages buy 3 slices of bread. Women and children turned to prostitution so that their families could be fed. Others, many others, died of malnutrition. By June 1944, there was a new fighting force in Italy, a guerrilla movement of socialists and communists operating behind the German lines in the north. Nazi and fascist troops tried to smash these partisan brigades. In a month, they exterminated 15,000 men. But a year later, the ranks had increased threefold to 250,000, each patriot determined to rid Italy of fascism. General Alexander said the world would one day know of their heroism. The Allies sent them few weapons, afraid that they would use them for a post-war revolution. But the partisans were not deterred. When captured, they paid the price. In reprisal for these acts of sabotage, whole villages were wiped out. "10,000 were shot in 18 months. In July, The sight of these young Italian soldiers on parade reminded Mussolini of happier times and banished for a while his mood of fatalistic gloom. He had come to Germany, where his new conscript army was in training, anxious to gain loyalty and to instill hatred for the partisan brigades. Convinced that Mussolini's efforts were futile, Hitler said, "When those unreliable Italians get back home, they'll run towards the partisans and join them." The prediction would come true. When Mussolini made his last official call on Hitler, the Führer was waiting as always, but this time badly shaken by a bomb attempt on his life. The Duce was delighted that Hitler too was plagued by traitors. But when he saw the extent of the damage to the Führer's headquarters, he had to agree that Hitler's miraculous escape was a sign from Providence that their cause was indestructible. Afterwards, the Führer hinted at secret weapons which would win the war, and Mussolini left for Italy revitalized. On December the 16th, 1944, after months of seclusion, Mussolini, who called himself the most hated man in Italy, defiantly appeared in Milan. He had deliberately chosen the city where fascism began as the setting for his final statement for the benefit of history. Mussolini's place in history, how he would compare with Napoleon, Caesar, Lenin, or even Jesus, was now his constant preoccupation. As he ranted on in the Lyric Theatre, his audience realized that, like a senile actor, he no longer remembered who he really was. He had spent his life creating stirring shows and deluding others, and in doing so, had fooled himself as well. Afterwards, Mussolini came onto the balcony for the last time, and to his surprise, the Milanese cheered him as loudly as before. Perhaps it was out of pity for a tired old man, or simply to prove that in spite of everything, they too could still put on a stirring show. Whatever the reason, he took it as proof that after all, he was still loved. And for days afterwards, he was happy. But as winter turned to spring 1945, the Allies began to advance again. Mussolini grew more and more dispirited. His health deteriorated, and he could eat only the simplest food. On the 25th of April, Mussolini received the final insult. Without informing him, the Nazis in Italy had surrendered. The partisans, who already controlled almost the entire countryside of northern Italy, now took over the towns. They arrested all known fascists and collaborators and held a victory parade of their own. On the 29th of April, 1945, the people of Milan surged forward once again to see the Duce. But now he was dead, shot by communist partisans whilst making for the Swiss frontier with his ever-faithful mistress, Clara Petacci. Not long before he died, Mussolini had said that if he was remembered only for having led the fickle Italians for 20 years. At least his name would not sink into oblivion. Certainly, he had earned a place in history, if not the one he wanted. A partisan's farewell was one of Mussolini's own favorite sayings. To each man comes the death that he deserves.